Welcome back to Star or Shovelware, my name's Luke, and today on the channel we're going to be checking out Don't Be Afraid on the Nintendo Switch. And this one is an adventure horror game where you play as a young boy who, after being kidnapped, finds himself trapped in a house filled with puzzles, with his only chance of escape being to solve them, while his psychotic kidnapper watches on, gleefully taunting him every step of the way. Now, there have been a number of different budget horror games released on the Switch in the past couple of years, and I myself have played quite a few of them, but let's see how Don't Be Afraid stands up amongst its competitors, and whether or not this one actually packs some scares. So I'm not going to be going into too much detail with the story on this one, as unlike many of the horror titles that I've reviewed on the channel, Don't Be Afraid actually puts quite an emphasis on its storyline, and I have to admit that this was a pleasant surprise, as I've found that many budget horror titles tend to just focus on trying to scare you and usually neglect the narrative elements in their titles. Don't Be Afraid, on the other hand, bases a lot of its gameplay elements actually around its narrative, and there's actually a decent amount of depth to its storyline, with large numbers of notes for you to find in levels, as well as cassette tapes, many of which are hidden away for eagle-eyed players to hunt down and find. Now, plot-wise, the game centres around David, a young 11-year-old boy who wakes up in the basement of an unfamiliar house with a creepy half-naked man standing over him. If that wasn't cause for alarm, the man then introduces himself as Mr. Franklin and apparently a friend of your father's, but he goes on to inform David that he's drugged him and brought him here to play what he deems to be a little game. But it seems you're not the only acquisition he's made, and as you work your way through the game, you'll discover the fate of others, both children and adults, who were also taken by Mr. Franklin and forced to play his little games. Now, a lot of the game is centred around puzzle solving, and Mr. Franklin observes your progression via security cameras that he's set up throughout his house. What I particularly enjoyed about this one though is that the game features full voice acting for both your kidnapper and the audio recordings that you find, and I thought that the voice acting was really well done, with Mr. Franklin's taunts and comments adding a good amount of character to the game and really carrying it, and he very much reminded me of Mark Hamilton's Joker in the Batman series of games. Now, the story itself isn't particularly unique so far as horror game plotlines go. The whole psycho kidnapper thing has been done many times before, but it's clear that the developers have really put some effort into trying to develop the backstory of both the kidnapper and the other characters you meet, and it's pretty solid stuff to be honest, though I have to admit that by the end of the game I still had questions, mainly down to me not spending the time to seek out all of the hidden notes and cassette tapes required to get the full picture. I also wasn't entirely sure about Mr. Franklin's motives either, or whether he actually had any, but in all honesty, the game was enjoyable enough without me having fully understood this, and it was just nice to have some substance to an indie horror game storyline, which I feel is something that's sadly missing from many of them, and it really does add a lot to what for the most part tend to be quite hollow and jump scare reliant titles. So gameplay then, and I'd say that Don't Be Afraid strikes a decent balance between its horror and puzzle elements. The game is divided into a number of different levels, and in each of them the objective is to usually work your way towards opening an exit door, solving puzzles and finding keys as you go, and learning a little about your kidnapper and his other captives via the aforementioned notes and cassette tapes. Now, the puzzle elements are generally pretty straightforward, and the solutions are usually hinted at by means of visual cues, often painted on walls or by means of the many mannequins that your captor appears to be somewhat obsessed with. These mannequins feature heavily throughout the game, being implemented into some of its puzzles, used as blockades, or often just as supplementary horror elements, as they frequently change their position when you're not observing them. The puzzle elements themselves though usually require you to obtain specific items or interact with switches and levers, and while they aren't particularly challenging, what makes them more difficult is the game's lighting, or lack thereof in this case. Now, being a horror game, it's expected that more often than not you'll find yourself in areas with little to no lighting, and while in this game you usually have a candle in hand to light your surroundings, at times it can still be quite difficult to spot certain items, and sometimes I spent a good few minutes searching the same area before coming across them. Another aspect of the game which I found to be a little bit frustrating was the fact that you'll frequently have to backtrack in areas to find items, but due to the game's mannequins continuously moving around, mind, they usually won't be in the last position in which you saw them at, and so you can't always rely on your memory in order to solve puzzles. Now when it comes to the game's horror elements, Don't Be Afraid doesn't just rely on jump scares to keep you on edge, and this was quite refreshing to see, as it's all too often that I play horror games and between the jump scares there's actually very little to keep the tension going. While it's not the scariest game I've ever played, it certainly tries to maintain its unsettling atmosphere, be that through its creepy mannequins, strange creatures that watch you from the shadows, or eerie ambient noises. There are of course the odd jump scare to catch you off guard, as well as several encounters with Mr. Franklin's subjects which involve stealthily avoiding them, or if this fails, running for your life and trying to find a spot to hide in, and these encounters add some nice variety to the game's scares, although I would say that the tension is reduced a little due to you instantly respawning at a checkpoint the moment they catch you. So I'm not going to go into any more details on the gameplay as to avoid inevitable spoilers, but when all's said and done with this one, I'd say that I was pleasantly surprised by the overall gameplay experience on offer here. While it does still feel like more of a budget title, it's clear that the effort was made with Don't Be Afraid to present the player with both an engaging storyline as well as a tense horror experience and a few puzzles to keep your brain active along the way. For the price, I'd also say that the game's length is very reasonable. There were several points at which I was expecting to see the end credits, however I was often mistaken, and I'd say that it took me around 4 or 5 hours to complete the game, but there are actually 3 different endings to obtain depending on the decisions you make and how many of the secret items you manage to find. Overall though, I had a good time playing this one, and Don't Be Afraid is definitely one of the best indie horror games I've played on the Switch since starting the channel. So visually, while there have obviously been some sacrifices when it comes to the texture resolutions, the Switch port of the game still looks pretty good. As with many horror games, the darkness makes the reductions in visual quality less noticeable, but we aren't talking potato vision with this one, and they've actually retained enough detail in the environments that you can easily identify what you're looking at, and thankfully the gory scenery and other horror elements don't lose any of their impact. On the audio side of things, the devs have kept things to a minimum with this one, with the eerie ambient background music and your own footsteps often being the only things you'll hear, and this just helps to emphasise and add tension whenever you hear anything out of the ordinary, and I particularly liked how in the sneak and chase sequences, you were actually able to rely on the noises made by the enemies to keep track of the positions and pick opportune moments to move. The standout point for me though had to be with the game's voice acting, and while the smaller less important characters were a little bit hit and miss, our resident psychopath Mr. Franklin was voiced excellently, and the voice actor did a great job of conveying his insanity with his very Joker-esque mannerisms. So performance wise, the game holds up pretty well on the Switch. There were very few frame rate dips to report, and the devs have done a good job of optimising this port without losing too much in the way of visual fidelity. Issues wise, there's also very little to report here. I've already mentioned the issues you may face with the low lighting, which adjusting the game's brightness does nothing to solve, but aside from this, some of the clues to the puzzles can be a little bit obscure, and I did experience several crashes at one point in the game, though I feel these may have been due to a particular optional item that you can acquire. All in all though, Don't Be Afraid is a great little horror title, and one of the only few that I can actually recommend picking up on the Switch. It's got a decent length thanks to its multiple endings and plenty of different secrets for you to discover, and while it isn't quite as polished as some of the more AAA horror titles, it's definitely up there amongst the better indie ones. When it comes to my own personal rating of the game, I'm going to be giving Don't Be Afraid 4 out of 5 stars. If you're on a budget and looking for a few scares, Don't Be Afraid is a solid option for the price. It strikes a good balance between its storyline and horror elements, and even if you're not one for puzzles, they're simple enough so that you shouldn't be stumped along with them. And so that about does it for this review of Don't Be Afraid on the Nintendo Switch. And so is this one you're going to be checking out? And if not, let me know why, and what your favourite horror game is in the comments section below. As always, make sure to hit that like button if this review helped you out, and if you watch my content regularly and enjoy it and are not yet subscribed to the channel, then please consider doing so. For now though, I just want to thank you all once again for watching, and until next time, take care of yourselves and game on.